Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Cosmic Connection, where we explore the order and the beauty of the cosmos and your connection to it all. My name is Amanda Poole Walsh. I'm the founder of Astrology Hub, and I am here with Rick Merlin Levine. And Rick, we're here for the November forecast. If we had to start with a theme, what would you say?
Don't do this to me.
Why? It's so good.
Well, yeah, there's a few songs that come to mind. There's Bob Dylan's song off of Blonde on Blonde that's stuck inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again. And if that doesn't sound strange enough for you, listen to it because it's even stranger. Or maybe there's his song off of John Wesley Harding, I think, and that is "There Must Be Some Way Out of Here," said the Joker to the thief. We're in a strange period of time right now, but we're right on schedule. That's the magic of all of this. Is like it's like we as astrologers can't, even though some of us would like to think we can, and some of us get lucky and bless them, but we can't ever fill in all the details. But we can paint in the energetic broad strokes. And all I can say is here we are at the beginning of November, and we are exactly on course.
So what is on course?
There must be some way out of here. Well, look, let's go just take a quick overview as we're coming toward the conclusion of the year. Technically, November is the penultimate month of the year. I love using that word that way correctly. It is the penultimate month of the year, and we have most of the year behind us. And yet we don't have most of the activity behind us because we have yet to have the culmination of what has been arguably one of the most intense and craziest years that we have ever seen. The sheer number of events that have been stuffed into this year that have kind of stretched us even further one way or another has been extraordinary. And we still got 2 months to go. And like I said, I don't want to say we haven't seen anything yet. We ain't seen nothing yet, because we have. But we definitely have some strangeness to work our ways through. And yet even the most strangest and most unpredictable won't really be that strange compared to where we are now. And I think the good news in all of this is that we are toward the end of this, and the importance of this year will last hopefully for a long time. The obvious, elephant in the middle of the room is the election, the American election. That's as how do I want to say this? As in balance or out of balance in balance. It's hung in the balance. In some ways, it is an ultimate statement of Libra, even though election day is held in the United States Scorpio time of year, which is very fitting because Scorpio is the cut away that which is no more, and then go through that process of transformation that then occurs. But we do have Venus and Mercury hanging back in Libra, and I think regardless of who you were behind in this election, if you were behind anyone, I think that many people are just surprised with how evenly balanced the entire thing is on some level. It's, I think, a lot less extreme than most people might have thought that it would be, and I think that says a lot. But what I think, though, is that the significant thing, and I said this, if not online here, I said it in my shortened version of my November forecast that only held up for the first few days of the month, because I didn't want to do my full November forecast until today or tomorrow. And so this is kind of like riding that energy, because because the election itself, well, let me put it this way. The reason why I wanted to wait to really zone in on the month of November, why we didn't do it last week, even here, is because the combination of Mercury turning direct midday on election day, that would have been on Tuesday the 3rd, that was just one piece of a much deeper and more powerful transition that we are not out of the woods on yet. And that is that last Sunday, Mercury slowing down to turn to turn direct after being retrograde for 3 weeks. Mercury still inching forward very, very slowly, made an exact square with Saturn. That would be Mercury at 26 degrees, 25, 26 degrees of Libra, making an exact square with Saturn at 25, 26 degrees of Capricorn. And that exact square happened just a few days ago. And then when Mercury turned direct on election day, that square was still within just about a half a degree of orb. So it's like over the course of this entire week, from November 1st, October 31st, all the way through today, which is what, November 5th, even tomorrow, November 6th, that square is made for the second time on November 6th, on tomorrow. And so we're hung in this place that even though Mercury has gone direct, Mercury moves so slowly. People have it wrong. People go, oh, Mercury's direct, everything's going to loosen up. Let's go. Things are going to. No, because when it moves direct, when it changes its stations and goes direct, from last Sunday to this Friday, Mercury has moved about a half a degree one way and then the other way. So it's just not moving yet. And Mercury, the planet of intellect, of thinking, of communication, 90 degrees to Saturn, the planet of constriction, the planet of holding the energy in, the planet of get it right before you do anything, the planet that says, no, not yet, not until I allow it, that this square wasn't going to allow anything to complete. And in fact, going back a week and a half or even longer than that, I have been saying, I think other astrologers have been also, that the Mercury changing direction, moving direct on election day won't give us any answers. In fact, we really won't have any sense of what's going on until after Mercury clears its square with Saturn. And that occurs actually tomorrow, very early in the morning. I say tomorrow, that would be Friday, November 6th. And so even then, Mercury is still within a degree of Saturn for the next day or so. So it's really not going to be till the weekend or till next week when we begin to get some forward movement on all this. And we still won't have resolution, because remember, this year, looking back, and this is where I started off, we began this year with a Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, Mercury, North Node, Sun cluster in Capricorn. And then during the year, we had early in the year, we had the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, January 12th, actually the day that China released the genome for the COVID-19 virus. And it was also the day that the first reported mortality from the virus occurred. That was on January 12th. And that was the first major, that was like the setting of the tone of the entire year. But then we had Jupiter conjuncting Pluto on April 4th. Now, remember, Pluto is the underworld. Pluto is that which is buried, that which is hidden. When Saturn and Pluto do their dance like they did back in January, but really are in phase all of last year, all of this year, and even into next year, Saturn, the planet of boundaries, and Pluto, the planet of disintegration, the deconstruction and reconstruction of reality, what happens is that boundaries brush up against each other, and they often form a great deal of stress and tension. And then typically the boundaries realign in some way. And often this conjunction is associated often with religious and ideological and even national boundaries. Major wars and conflicts often correspond with this. But interestingly enough, a virus is an invasion of our boundary. It's a disintegration of our boundary. And as I've mentioned here, I think before, the Saturn-Pluto alignment very closely coordinates with many major pandemics, including Black Death. In the mid 1450s, 1450 was when it kind of peaked, and so that is a significant piece. But the other piece in all of this is that Jupiter lined up with Pluto on April 4th, and even more so than Saturn and Pluto, Jupiter, the planet of expansion, Jupiter, the planet of amplification, of exaggeration, of bigger, of more, Jupiter makes anything into more grandiose. It's why it's foreign travel, because you have to go far. It's anything that's expansive. And when Jupiter lines up with Pluto, as it does every 13 years, there is often a bubbling up or an expansion of things that were buried. And oddly enough, or interestingly enough, this also, like clockwork, corresponds with a variety of pandemics. And you can track this one back also. So, and the reason for that is because Jupiter is inflationary. And so going back to when this virus first became, running around in late February, it was kind of when something began to happen. Because I remember I was still in Indonesia and I was going to spend a few days in Taiwan on my way back to the United States. And the virus put a cancel to that, because if I were to leave the airport, I probably wouldn't have gotten back out of Taiwan at that point in time. So, but even back then, and again, many other astrologers immediately looked at the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction on April 4th and said, this is going to be an expansive, this is going to be a peak point in this pandemic. And sure enough, the last weeks of March and the first week of April was when, in particular, Italy and New York City was just, exploding, so to speak. And what's interesting here is that we normally think of Pluto and as the underworld, as that which is hidden, the unconscious, even that which is out of sight, and Pluto as expansive. Like in some ways, things should just get, like gradually bigger. But I've spent some time with with scuba gear and a regulator in my mouth down at around 30, 40, or 50 feet. Beneath the surface in water. And one of the things that you realize is that a bubble that is this big at 40 or 50 feet, as the bubble comes up to the surface, the bubble expands and expands and expands until by the time it reaches the surface and comes out into the open, it can be a bit explosive. And so in a way, this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction that caused an explosion or a peak of the pandemic back in April, and when that happened, I and many other astrologers said, well, it isn't over yet, because Jupiter and Pluto are going to make a second conjunction on June 29th. And sure enough, in June and early July, there was what some people called the second wave, and other people said, no, it's just a continuation of the first wave. But nevertheless, there was another expansive or an increase in amplification in the numbers. Why are we talking about this? Well, one of the key events of November is that on November 12th, Jupiter will make its third and final alignment with Pluto. And so here we are again we're having, we're a week away from that exact date, and we have the largest numbers that we've reported to date since the beginning of the epidemic, pandemic, whatever you want to call it, back in February, March. We now have the largest numbers that we've ever had, and it looks like they're going to grow. I'm not an epidemiologist. I've never played one on TV. I'm not an expert when it comes to these things. I just read the news and I try to read it from many sources. But it does seem like these numbers are just out of control, and they're out of control in places like North Dakota. I mean, we're not in New York City anymore, so to speak. So this is a key piece of November, and so Jupiter is lining up with Pluto for the third time. Saturn and Pluto are already done, but by December, we have Jupiter now the fastest moving of the three planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto. We have Jupiter now for the third and final time catching up with Pluto, and then it's going to catch up with Saturn. And of course, many people have been talking about this. Both Jupiter and Saturn move into Aquarius, and on the solstice on December 21st, they make a conjunction in Aquarius, new sign, no longer in Capricorn, not coming back to Capricorn by retrograde, Jupiter not for another 12 years, and Saturn not for another 27, 28 years. And so this phase of this energy is done. Within all of this, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto did a major retrograde together through April, May, June, July, August, September. They began to turn direct September, October. But within that, then Mercury and Mars turned retrograde. And so this election day, less than a day of an election, is a day when Mercury turns direct. And next week, actually on the 13th, I think it is. Yeah, on the 13th, next week, Mars turns direct. And so by that point, all of these planets that have been culprits in this, Uranus and Pluto are still Uranus and Neptune are still retrograding. Neptune turns direct toward the end of around the 28th of November. But they're not major culprits in what's been going on. And so I really think that not only is it Mercury turning direct and then passing its square to Saturn by tomorrow, and then moving on from that early next week, but then Mars turning direct, and it will take Mars a few days for it to kind of really get itself back in gear, even a week or so. And so I don't think we're going to see real clarity on this towards middle end of November, even if that may linger even beyond that, but there'll be some movement certainly by then. So that's part of why when you ask for a song or for keywords or whatever, it's like Yogi Berra saying "Déjà vu" all over again. The planets are either moving direct or ready to move direct, but we're not yet freed from our feet stuck in this kind of like sticky epoxy like super glue that's not letting us move forward yet, but we will.
So Rick, after April 4th and June 29th, when Jupiter and Pluto met last time, we had like a culminating moment, and then it seemed to kind of dissipate. So would you anticipate after November 12th that this whole coronavirus story will begin to dissipate?
Yes. In theory, the answer is yes. In practice, I don't have a damn clue. I mean, I hate to keep disappointing people by my lack of being able to predict the future. You think, geez, I'm, kind of like, in the upper echelons of astrologers, blah, 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 blah. But I honestly don't know. And yeah, theoretically, that's what should happen. Theoretically, if you look at what the past and what the path here is, theoretically, this should be the third and final swing on this. But we still have the Jupiter Saturn to happen at the end, around the solstice. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful that that's kind of what will happen, but I don't know.
So you're thinking that we aren't really going to have a lot of clarity on things pretty much this entire month.
uh, I, the reason why I'm hesitating is that I think part of the problem we're in is that that so many people have clarity on what's going on, and yet the clarity that they have is very different from one another.
Mhm.
So yes, I think people will have clarity, but that's not the issue anymore. The issue is not having clarity when clarity is different for me and for you or for us or in them or whatever. The problem is that people who have too much clarity think they know what's going on. I would include myself in that, and we don't. And so I think it becomes less an issue of clarity than it is an issue of recognition of the multiplicity of perspectives.
Mm.
And that doesn't mean that one person who has a perspective needs to grant the other person's perspective as the truth. But I think we need to grant that the other person's perspective is the other person's perspective. And that's something that I think a lot of people are not willing to do. They're just, want to discount it. And so, I think that there is more. I think there's forward movement this month. I think we begin to see that we're going to unstick ourselves from this state of being trapped in the middle. And that's not an indication of my knowing how we are going to do that or in which direction we are going to do that. It's just that's going to happen. We are going to move forward. And I think it may take really until mid-January, which I get is after presidential inauguration. But I think it might take not only for Mars to go direct, although that will certainly have impact on what's going on, at least now politically in the United States. But I think also the Jupiter Pluto conjunction will have impact. I think the fact that we're coming into a season of eclipses. The first eclipse is on November 30th. So that falls within the contractual obligations of talking about November. We get to talk about that, so to speak. But we have two eclipses coming up, and I think that all of this becomes fuel for the forward movement and the progression of moving into territory that we've never been in before. We're moving into new territory.
Okay, so let's talk. Well, actually, let me ask you a question about Saturn, Jupiter in Aquarius. I wish I knew who posted it on social media. I think it was maybe Tammy Brunk, but I could be wrong. So sorry if I'm misquoting you, Tammy. But one of the quotes or the post was about how this year has been a lot about restructuring our existing systems and structures. I mean, that's been one of the things that's come to our awareness.
Which would be Capricornian.
Right. Yeah. Which is, it's come to our awareness that it needs to be done. Whether or not it's done right now is another story. But would you say that Saturn and Jupiter moving into Aquarius would start to invite us to rethink the way we treat each other, rethink the way that we, like you were talking about, the multiplicity of perspectives and how we actually engage with each other within that multiplicity?
I think that could be part of it. I think it's also beginning to look ahead and thinking about, rather than what's wrong with the current structure, how are we going to change the current structure? What are we doing as we watch some of the main pieces of the current structure disintegrate before our eyes? As all of that's going on with the planets in Capricorn, as Jupiter and Saturn move into Aquarius, we begin to look off into the future. And again, I think it was Bucky Fuller, who said, rather than fixing structures that exist, or saying what's wrong with them, you make structures that are better. You make improvement happens by visualizing something that's better, and then that eventually replaces it. And I think that we've been in this process of the deconstruction of what is, And I think that to some extent, the Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius become an envisioning or a visualization of, and then a movement into that which is in the future rather than in the past. But let's not forget that Pluto stays in Capricorn until the next presidential election. So we're not done with Capricorn. Pluto definitely has the last word, which is kind of Pluto's job anyhow. But for now, even though we are moving ahead, Pluto's not going to let us be done with what we need to attend to, as the old structures or the old beliefs or the old systems or the old monetary systems or fill in the blanks with whatever you want, until they're thoroughly deconstructed so they can be reconstructed anew.
Okay, so we have the action that happened with Mercury. We're still in that. So squaring Saturn, and as it's turning direct, we have that in the beginning of the month, and then we have.
And technically, it's already squared. Technically, it's already turned direct, and by this weekend, by the 6th, 7th, 8th, it will be past the square to Saturn.
Okay, and then on November 12th, we have the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. And then on November 13th, we have Mars going direct.
Yes.
So what else?
Then we have a new moon on the following day, on the 14th.
Okay. And you said that Neptune and Uranus are not major culprits or players in the storyline of this year. Why do you say that?
Well, look, every planet is always there. It's just that the Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto thing has been so loud that they've taken the spotlight. Not everyone can be the star of the same show. Now, when we get to next year, Uranus becomes a major star of the show next year. We talked about that, I think, last week when we looked at 2 weeks ago, when we looked at 2021, because we have Saturn squaring Uranus through 2021 and into 2022. And then all of a sudden, Pluto is not as on center stage as it was through 2020. So I'm not saying that these planets are unimportant. I'm just saying that outer planets typically, they go retrograde once a year, and they stay retrograde for about 5 months. Depends on the planet, but for about 5 months or so. And I personally do not often see major correlations around those planets turning direct or retrograde, meaning those planets stationary, compared to the faster moving planets like Mercury, Venus, Mars, and even Jupiter. It was Johannes Kepler that said that the reason why the Mercury retrograde was so noticeable compared to the other planets, and remember, he didn't even have Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto to compare to, but he was comparing to, in particular, Jupiter and Saturn. He said the reason why Mercury retrogrades are so noticeable is that Mercury moves so fast that when it metaphorically screeches on the brakes and goes into reverse, we know it. We can feel that immediate change of direction. But when you look at the planets like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they're crawling along at just inches a day, at least from our perspective. And when they slow down to turn retrograde or direct, they don't slow down that much because they weren't moving that fast to begin with. And then when they go retrograde, it's like they're not going very fast. So, and I would say the exception on the outer planet retrogrades is that if you, in your natal birth chart, have a planet either at the degree that an outer planet, or within a degree or so of an outer planet stationing, turning retrograde or direct, or if you have a planet that is aspected by that planet while it's in its shadow, meaning a point at which the planet will go across an aspect in your chart, whether it's a square or a trine or an opposition or a conjunction, but a planet going across it, a slow-moving planet, I'm talking here Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, goes across it and then retrogrades back across that same spot and then goes direct across it again. And with Neptune and Pluto, it could go a fourth and a fifth time. Now, in that case, those retrogrades are going to be important to you, but you still might not notice the retrograde dates. So that, in fact, Neptune turns direct after having been stationary for 5.5 months. It turns direct on November 28th. I don't necessarily ascribe a particular change in consciousness or an event on that day. That's just me.
Okay, so you started talking about the new moon on the 14th, and you gave us a tiny glimpse into the full moon eclipse at the end of the month. Do you want to go into those a little bit more?
Sure. So the new moon on the 14th actually occurs at 23 degrees. I'm just there it is. It's at 23 degrees of Scorpio, and so anybody who has a planet in toward the end of a fixed sign, if anyone has a planet in their chart at 20 to 25 degrees of Scorpio, Aquarius, Taurus, or Leo, this eclipse is going, or this I'm sorry, new moon, it's not an eclipse, this new moon will square their natal chart and perhaps bring more energy into their life. Now, what we do on new and full moons is we look at first, does the new moon and full moon make a particular aspect to other planets? And if so, what are those aspects? And it turns out that the new moon at 23 degrees of Scorpio is sextile Jupiter at 23 degrees of Capricorn. And this is what we call a partile aspect. The word partile just means within the same degree. So 23 degrees to 23 degrees, it's a partile sextile. And sextiles are supportive. They're cooperative. The energy flows not as easily as a trine because they're in the same element, but the energy still flows and it works together. And so this indicates that there is something expansive and positive and Jupiterian, optimistic, uplifting that we can feel around this particular time. However, and there's always a however, the fact is that Venus is at 22 degrees of Libra, meaning that 22 degrees of Libra to 23 degrees of Scorpio is one sign, which is 30 degrees, which is a half of a sextile, a semi-sextile. And semi-sextiles can be annoying. They're not an easy flow of energy. They're disjointed, if you will. But what that means is if the new moon is at 23 degrees of Scorpio and it's 2 signs away from Jupiter, which is 2 signs, 30, 60 degrees, a sextile to Jupiter, in Capricorn, and Venus is 1 sign further away from Jupiter than the new moon is, it turns out that Venus is squaring Jupiter. So we have the new moon sextiling Jupiter, and we have Venus squaring Jupiter. And this is the irritation of that semi-sextile, because on one hand, the new moon feels fine. It feels like the transformations are unfolding as they should. By the way, that new moon is also sextiling Pluto, because remember, Jupiter and Pluto were exactly aligned just a couple of days prior on the 12th. And that means that Venus is squaring Pluto and squaring Jupiter. And this is a bit of a tougher aspect. This is an aspect that has us going deeper than we want to go. This is an aspect that brings stuff out into the open that may not necessarily be as pleasant as Venus would like it to be. And so, I mean, what's new? A lot of the whole year has been like that. But this new moon is powerful from those perspectives. And then on top of that, there is 2 other things that kick into this new moon. One is the fact that Mercury, having moved into Scorpio, remember that Mercury had retrograded back into Libra, and Mercury moves back into Scorpio on November 10th. Mercury reaches 5 degrees of Scorpio on the day of the full moon, on the 14th, which forms a quincunx with Chiron at 5 degrees of Aries. Chiron is the healer. Chiron is the mentor. Chiron is the teacher. Chiron represents our vulnerabilities that if we become aware of them, we can work with them. Mercury quincunxing Chiron is, again, it's awkward. It's like words that are meant to heal might just rub people the wrong way. It's just another piece of this. Mercury in this whole scenario is not a happy camper, not only because Mercury on the day of the new moon on the 14th is making that quincunx with Chiron, but over the next few days, Mercury then makes an opposition with Uranus. And this is an opposition that I've talked about before, because Mercury made an opposition to Uranus before it turned retrograde back at the beginning of October. And then it retrograded back over that point again. And now it's going direct the third and final time. And Mercury opposite Uranus can also be like brain shattering. It's, so we have a combination of events here that can be quite powerful as far as bringing things out into the open and turning things around and making something happen. Is this a finality? No, but it's a new moon, and it is I don't want to say a turning point, because we've just had so many damn turning points, but it's a point of separation from what it is that's been going on that allows us, I think, or forces us perhaps to move on into the future. One last thing about this, not so much about the new moon, but we talked earlier about Mercury's square with Saturn that we're in the throes of right now, the days before, the day of, and the days after Election Day in the United States. So Mercury, by that new moon, is off into Scorpio, and it's no longer involved in that square. However, Venus, which was all the way back at the beginning of Libra, back in October, Venus is now moving through Libra. And by November 14th, Venus, as I mentioned earlier, is square both Pluto and Jupiter in Capricorn at 23 degrees. But it takes that Venus a few more days before it squares Saturn on November 19th. And so here we see another replay of the being trapped, of the being stuck, maybe a setback of some sort. And of course, then just after that, Venus then moves into Scorpio on the 21st, the same day that the sun moves into Sagittarius. And so, like, on one hand, the energy deepens with Venus moving into Scorpio, but the sun moving into Sagittarius is basically the harbinger of the wide open holiday season, whether it's wide open or not. It's the idea that once the sun moves into Sagittarius, we are no longer stuck in the trico. We are no longer, in the super glue. All of a sudden, it's like the leaves are off the trees and we can see forever. And that idea of Sagittarius is again the distance. And so I think that the energy through this middle part of the month up to the 21st is certainly ready to shift and does make some shifts. And there's a handful of trines in there that sweeten the energy. On November 9th, the sun trines Neptune, and Mercury trines Neptune on the 23rd. And these are energies that allow the imagination to think about the possibilities and to open us up to the future, perhaps not restrained by what we feel is holding us back in the present moment.
Okay, so I think the last piece is probably that full moon eclipse, yeah?
I think so. Although on the way to it, when Venus is Venus moves past the square to Saturn, and then Venus moves into Scorpio, as I mentioned, on the 21st. But then by November 27th, still prior to the full moon, Venus hits that same place where Mercury was when Mercury opposed Uranus. Venus opposes Uranus on November 27th. And there's some very opening aspects around that period of time. Mercury's making sextiles with the Capricorn group, and that Venus opposing Uranus is saying, all right, I like the future. There's a break again. There's this kind of attraction to something completely different than what we thought. And Venus opposing Uranus often is a twist of fate and a surprise, but we make it work typically. And that leads us then up to the full moon eclipse. And this full moon eclipse is, let me just get there here real quickly. There we go. So the full moon eclipse is on November 30th. And again, we have a second eclipse, a new moon eclipse. I think it's on December 14th. I can check on that date in just a moment. I don't want to take my eyes from the chart that I'm looking at with the actual new moon itself. I'm sorry, the full moon itself. But this full moon is a full moon in Gemini because the sun is in Sagittarius now. And so this is an informational full moon. This is a full moon that has to do with thinking, with thoughts, with communication, and yet they're not necessarily grounded. And the difficulty of this full moon is that the full moon is making a square and a half. That's a sesqui-square with Saturn. Actually, with the entire Capricorn pack. It's, I think, closest with Jupiter. Let me see here. It's actually closest with Pluto. That's the tightest. So the Pluto sesqui-square, or the full moon sesqui-square Pluto, which means also then that the sun is a half a square to Pluto. These are both within a half a degree of orb, very, very close. And so this indicates some real dynamic stress, some power of what's not sitting right that's still beneath the surface. So this may be after some, going back to the election, this may be after some rules or some things have settled, maybe not everything even by this point, but the way in which they settle may make some people really upset. And which people that is, I don't know. But the fact that this full moon is in this awkward aspect with Pluto, it kind of indicates to me that something's not okay, even though that Gemini kind of can go any way. It blows with the breeze, it changes directions, but it's not necessarily a happy camper in this situation. The other thing that's happening at this full moon is that Mercury, at the latter degrees of Scorpio, is finishing up its sextiles, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, with the Capricorn cluster. And that would be Pluto, Jupiter, and actually on the day of the full moon, Mercury makes a sextile with Saturn, which I think is good news. I think that helps the cause, whatever the cause may be, because what it does is it gives us a sense of the truth. It gives us a sense of this may not be the way you want it, but this is the way it is, and it's real. Mercury sextile Saturn. And yet being an eclipse, often eclipses stir up things that force us to let go of something that we held on to in the past. And this coming into eclipse season, I think we have some of that stuff stirring up. And, as much as I know the astrological party line about eclipses, I look at the past few eclipses, and although there was some weather, there was fires on the Oregon eclipse, the Great American Eclipse. I mean, there were things that happened. They didn't necessarily produce the results that many astrologers had had forecast. And I'm not making them unimportant. I'm just saying we need to wait and see. But this is certainly the beginning of a season. And I say this, I mean November, but I mean the lunations, both the new moon, the middle of the month, and the full moon, the end of the month. These are both beginnings of the ending. It's the transition that began maybe a year ago or more, before the actual Saturn-Pluto conjunction in January. It's like there's light at the end of the tunnel. And of course, I'm reminded of that saying, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's a train heading for me. Regardless, I think that there is an opening that we are coming to.
Okay, so what would you say to people who are feeling that that feeling of being trapped or being stuck, like you've said, the glue stuck to our feet? What would you say the astrology is inviting us to do if that's the way that we're feeling?
Well, I think the astrology is inviting us to do as it always does, to be aware of what's external and not beat the crap out of ourselves trying to swim against the tide. And again, this does not mean to just be quiet. Patience isn't being quiet. It's not being lazy. It's about doing your work while you're waiting for a tide to ride in the right direction. Again, I come back to that surfer analogy that I use sometimes. And it's the, active watching and paying attention is making sure that when the wave comes, you're ready to jump on it. Now, I think that people, that we have a high level of frustration everywhere. I mean, from one end of the political spectrum to the other, from one end of the country to the other. We are a culture right now that has been cooped up, for nearly a year on some level, and we're all looking for some immediate gratification, escape, opening, and I think it's going to happen more gradually than we want. And so I think the most important thing is to be cautious about how we express our feelings, and to understand the difference between reaction and response. That it's important to respond, but not necessarily as we react. My words for today on my Instagram feed was curb your anger. Obviously, a play on Curb Your Enthusiasm. It doesn't mean to bury it. It doesn't mean to not feel it. It just means to curb it, because hitting someone or yelling nasty words at someone or losing your temper at someone doesn't necessarily help your cause. It's like and again, this is almost less astrology than it is common sense. But if you know astrologically that everyone has all this pent up energy, and that planets, even though they're not retrograde, Mercury, it's still not really moving. Communication is still bottled up because of the square to Saturn, and that Mars, even though it turns direct middle of the month, still is going to take weeks to get out of its shadow. It's still, we're still feeling stuck. And if you know that astrologically, cosmologically, cosmically, that there's some restraint, save your energy. Don't work it out in some way that can be productive when you need it, rather than just yelling and screaming or hitting or being angry at some target that doesn't necessarily respond positively when you get angry at it. And again, I'm not telling anyone to bury their feelings. I'm just saying, and I'm not even saying that we should be abiding our time. I'm not even saying that. What I'm saying, though, is that we need to pay attention to the long term, which is what I've been saying for months now, because we are so wrapped up in a point of intensity and focus. And it's like an inflection point where there's way more energy focused on this moment than there should be, but there is. And that anything that we can do to just slow down the process so that Pluto transformation, so that Pluto can do his work in the most constructive manner.
2 weeks ago, you talked about the bend and being around the bend, and that we aren't around the bend, or
We are
we
not
weren't
around
then.
the bend.
Would you say we're still not around the bend?
I would still say we are not. I would say that there's a lot of bends, and we may have kind of begun to circle or to circumnavigate one of them, but we're not around the bend. We won't fully be around this bend until Mars. Remember, Mars, when it went direct and then retrograde, Mars now back at about 50, well, it goes all the way back to 15 degrees of Aries before it turns direct, mid-November. As Mars goes forward, Mars is going to make its third and final squares to Pluto, Saturn, and Jupiter in that order, whereas before it was Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn, because Jupiter had retrograded all the way back. And so it's not really until Mars makes its final squares, Mars in its own sign of Aries, having been retrograde and soon direct, and Saturn in its own sign of Capricorn, having been retrograde and now it's direct. So in December, when Mars first squares Pluto, then squares Saturn, because Saturn and Jupiter by January have both moved into Aquarius, and Mars moves into Taurus. Mars in Aries moves into Taurus. And once Mars is in Taurus, then it makes a square, its final square, to Saturn and to Jupiter. And then Mars in Taurus is going to line up with Uranus in Taurus. And I think that ultimately it will take until that Mars in January, excuse me, until that Mars in January actually reaches the squares to Mercury and Jupiter, which is through the middle of January. And then it reaches its conjunction with Uranus, which is around the 20th, 21st of January. That's going to be when we're around the bend, and then we can figure out what's next.
Okay. So in summary, we are in a culminating moment of the year. You quoted some Bob Dylan songs. There must be some way out of here, said the Joker to the thief. And then the other one, I can't even remember.
It's stuck inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again.
Right. All right.
It's basically, it's from a Bob Dylan album where he'd worked himself in. The album was called Blonde on Blonde, and it's about as metaphysical, meaning no connection with physicality. The song is a very, very humorous but kind of dire mixture of things that just don't go together. Shakespeare is in the alley, I tried to get a letter to you, but the mailbox was lost. The energy, everything in that song is not quite right. And it's, oh, mama, can this really be the end? Stuck inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues again. It's like there's just this feeling of weariness, and like we've been here before, and how do we get out of here?
It's like surreal weariness too.
Very, very definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So we are going to feel like we're still hung in the balance. There could be some forward movement, but no real resolution or that moment of like, oh, it all makes sense, that, real clarity moment that is not on the near horizon.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. We have Mars going direct. We won't have real clarity, which you also said we might not really. I mean, we might have our own clarity, but that doesn't mean we collectively have clarity, because
I might know exactly what's going on, and Fred might know exactly what's going on. We're both clear, and yet our views of clarity can be very opposed, and that's the peculiarity of this moment.
Right. And then, so we have that middle of the month period, the November 12th, 13th, 14th, where we have Jupiter, Pluto conjunct, then we have Mars direct, and then we have the new moon. And all of it has, I mean, you talked about bringing things out into the open that aren't necessarily pleasant. There's kind of an awkward, annoying energy around that new moon as well. Yeah, So it's kind of that's a little cluster right there in the middle of the month.
It is a little bit of a cluster, and it is a bit of a turning point unto itself. The month the month is confusing energetically. It doesn't mean that it's confusing, but there's like lots of little pieces that don't necessarily all go together, and yet when you put them all together, they spell mother. No, isn't that an old saying or something? No, it's but when you put them all together, there is progress that has begun to occur, whatever that means.
Okay. All right. So we have November 19th. I can't remember exactly what the aspect was, but there could be this sense of a setback, feeling trapped,
Venus square Saturn.
Venus square Saturn. Okay. All right. And then we have November 27th, Venus opposing Uranus, which could bring about some sort of twist of fate.
Yeah. Something unexpected, an attraction to something, Venus, that we don't normally like or don't normally be but it could be something occurs that is out of the blue, like, wow, where did that come from?
Okay. And this is collectively and personally.
Oh yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, and then November 30th, we have the full moon eclipse. It's squares, is sesqui square.
Yeah, sesqui is like 1.5, like a sesquicentennial is 150 years, 100.5.
Okay, with the Capricorn pack or council, whatever you want to talk about it. And you're telling us that eclipses force us to let go.
Yeah, they take something from the past. They flip time around and often kind of have us looking back and then letting go of something.
Okay. And you're saying that full moon eclipse also indicates a real dynamic stress, which may make people upset.
Yeah. Well, I think all month we have that going.
Yeah.
But yes, on the eclipse particularly.
Exactly. Okay. And you are advising, or the astrology is advising, and you're interpreting it for us, not to swim against the tide. That this is a time to be in active waiting. So you're not saying necessarily put your head in the sand and just wait until it's all over.
Absolutely not.
But also don't waste your energy fighting battles that aren't going to be won and or aren't going to be won by attacking, to just cultivate our energy and channel it more consciously or strategically.
Exactly. Anyone who has ever done any ocean swimming has heard the lesson that when you're caught in a riptide, don't exhaust yourself trying to swim against it. That you just stop and you go with the tide, the current, until you get a very clear direction of which way it's moving you. And then you pick a 90-degree angle and you swim that way. And I had that experience once in my life, swimming off the coast of St. Augustine. I was alone swimming comfortably. And I reached a point where I'm getting a little tired. And I looked out and the beach that I entered in was like a dot. It was like, how did that happen? And I immediately swam like 3 or 4 strokes back toward the beach and realized I wasn't making any progress. And I panicked and my heart rate went up. And I said, no, Rick, you know what to do here. Stop being an idiot. Just calm, relax, float with the tide. Get your breath, get your center, and then figure out your course of action. And I did. And I was drifting further away, but I'm okay. I could float for hours, and I floated and I got that. And then I picked a direction and I swam out of it. That's what we need to be doing.
Well, and you've been talking a lot, both in the Astrology Foundation's course and then also in last week's Cosmic Connection, about the nodes and quantum astrology, about how our charts actually create a hum, or it's music, and that's where the music of the spheres. So you've brought in Bob Dylan for this month in this kind of like irreconcilable poetry that just kind of doesn't make sense. It's a little all over the place, and that's kind of the hum of this month, right?
Yes.
And so we're choosing how to dance with that. And in this, there's a little bit of a surrender to the energy, to the time, pay attention to the long term, don't try to really make sense of it right now. It's not actually
Yeah,
going to
I
make
don't think
a
we
lot of
can
sense.
make sense of it all right now. But you brought up the nodes. Remember that eclipses are simply new moons and full moons that occur near the nodes. The nodes right now are Gemini to Sagittarius. The
Mhm.
north node is in Gemini, south node is in Sagittarius. So as the sun moves through the sign of Sagittarius, it's going to approach the south node. And as it does, there'll be a new moon as the sun and moon are approaching the south node. And then on the other side of it, the moon will be halfway around. And then there'll be a full moon eclipse. And the new moon eclipse and full moon eclipse both are involve that nodal pattern, which ties us to something deeper. That's why eclipses are so important.
And what would you say that nodal pattern is? I know we've talked about this before, but the Gemini Sagittarius nodal pattern, what do you think that's inviting?
Well, it's communication, information. It's the information that connects the dots. The Gemini just gather information, and the Sagittarius, where am I going to go with it? How am I going to take this somewhere? And so it's coordinating both the nearby and the far away, if you will, or the little thoughts that may be unimportant, the chitter chatter, the noise in our lives, with the overall purpose and or direction of our lives.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I feel like we have a good understanding of the energy of the month, and that and knowing this enables us to help the people around us too, who may be, holding their breath and waiting and glued to the TV or whatever they're watching, and just this enables a sense of peace really amongst the chaos, because
Yeah,
it's
I definitely agree with that. And in today's Instagram thing that I wrote with the curb your anger, I ended it with a quote from George Jackson, who said, "Patience has its limits. Take it too far, and it's cowardice."
mm,
So I'm not suggesting that we should all just go to sleep and bury our anger, just to be really clear. But
right.
I'm suggesting that by just being angry doesn't get us to where we're going. In fact, it can make our goals farther and farther away
Hmm. Yeah, and make us really sick too. In the meantime.
and make us really sick too.
Yes. Speaking of, I'm actually going to be speaking with Kira Sutherland next, who is, um, she practices like medical astrology,
Yeah,
pretty
well,
much.
she's a licensed naturopath.
Right. So she's going to be on next. So if you want to meet Kira and talk about health and astrology, we're going to be doing that next. And Rick, thank you so much for this insight into November. Super, super helpful. And we'll see you all next week. In the meantime, this I just want to say this one last time. Astrology Foundations, well, maybe not one last time forever, but one last time for this 5-week period we've been in. Rick's course, Astrology Foundations, is in its final live week. That doesn't mean you can't join us later. But one of the benefits of joining us right now is that you would get to also jump into the inner circle early if you want. So Astrology Hub's Inner Circle, where you get to learn from a different astrologer every month. We're going to open that up to Astrology Foundation students for just a few days. For those of you who want to jump in and experience the lunar cycle with Jennifer Rassiopi, the astrologer Jennifer Rassiopi, her mastery class is on working with eclipses in the chart. So if you like that topic and you want to dive deeper into eclipses, that's what her mastery class topic is going to be. So you could join Astrology Foundations right now and then have the opportunity to jump into the inner circle early. We're going to officially open it up in December, but you could actually get 1 month early for
And
that.
where, Amanda, would they go to join or to enroll in the course, Foundations of Astrology?
Astrologyhub.com/foundations, astrologyhub.com/foundations. So you can do that now. And we'd love to have you. We have our final Q&A tomorrow, which is Friday, November 6th with Rick. And if you can't make that live, it's okay. The recordings are available to you. It has been an incredible journey. I mean, it's so much fun, Rick. And it's been for so many people like Christmas or their birthday every Sunday to get the lessons. And just the enthusiasm from all the students is amazing.
The
And
feedback has been very heartwarming. Yeah, it's been Yeah, it took way more than I thought it would in order to get something that I felt was really lasting and cohesive. And from the feedback of everyone, it seems like we've accomplished that. So I'm very pleased with this course.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for being here, for tuning into this episode, for being a part of our community, and as always, for making astrology a part of your life. We'll catch you on the next episode.